Lecture 10. The Nature of Truth and Time.
Last lecture, David Lewis suggested that persons are time worms. Persons don't exist at a particular moment in time, but instead exist as four-dimensional objects, as a collection of person slices stretched out over time. But since your time worm won't be complete until your life is over, this has the odd consequence of entailing that persons don't exist until they die. That is, unless you believe that future events of your life exist before they occur. But how could that be true? And what could that even mean? This gives rise to questions about the very nature of time, and it is to such questions that we will now turn. To begin, let's first explore a problem related to time that is important to theologians and philosophers of religion: the problem of human freedom and divine foreknowledge. In a nutshell, the problem is this: how is it that we can freely choose to do what we do if God knew beforehand that we were going to do it? But how freedom and foreknowledge are incompatible might not be immediately obvious, so let me elaborate. First of all, it seems fairly intuitive that for you to freely choose to do some particular action, it must also be possible for you to not choose that action. If it is not even possible for you to not, say, eat pizza for lunch at noon tomorrow instead of sweet potato fries, then you can't do it freely. This is called the libertarian definition of free will. Often it is expressed like this: free will requires alternate possibilities. We'll talk more about it later. And speaking of libertarians, it's probably important to make clear that we are not talking here about political freedom, the kind of thing that political libertarians usually argue for. We're not talking about political libertarians either. Whether there should be laws against humans performing certain actions and which actions should be prohibited are entirely different topics. Debates about those topics use the word freedom, but they are not talking about the metaphysical notion of human free will. Regardless of what laws are on the books, you supposedly have the ability to choose or not choose to do any action that is openly available to you. Whether you decide to do it is supposedly up to you. You have that power. What metaphysical libertarians say about free will is that you have that power only if it's possible for you to not choose as you do. Now, if God exists, he would supposedly be perfect, which means that he could never be wrong and would know everything, including what will happen before it happens. But suppose God believed yesterday that you would choose to have pizza at noon for lunch tomorrow. Would it be possible for you to not choose to have pizza at noon for lunch tomorrow? It doesn't seem so, even though you don't know what belief he had. If you don't choose to eat pizza, you would make the belief that God had yesterday false. And that can't happen. God can't have false beliefs. The only way you could not choose to eat pizza would be by somehow changing the belief that God had yesterday. But you can't do that either. You can't change the past. Once something has occurred, it occurred. That's why there's no use in crying over spilt milk. Crying can't unspill the milk because it's already spilled. Once God has believed what he has believed, you can't undo the fact that he believed it. You can't fail to choose pizza for lunch tomorrow because you can't change or make false God's past belief that you would. But if you can't fail to choose pizza for lunch tomorrow, then you cannot do so freely. Free will requires alternate possibilities. And so it seems the assumption that God has foreknowledge of the future is incompatible with the notion that humans have free will. That is the freedom and foreknowledge problem. There is a wealth of literature on this problem. I actually wrote my dissertation on it, so I could go on for hours about this, but I will try to be brief. Some try to answer this problem by pointing out that God doesn't cause your action. He doesn't choose the pizza for you. But notice that causation was not mentioned once in the entire argument. It doesn't suggest you're not free because you can't cause your action. In fact, it admits that you are the cause of your action. It suggests that you are not free because you couldn't cause anything else. It's true that if God caused your action, you wouldn't be free, But even if you do cause your action, you are still not free if you can't fail to cause the action that you do. Others try to solve the problem by pointing out that you don't do what you do because God believes that you would do it, but that God believed what he believed because of what you will do. Others try to solve the problem by pointing out that you don't do what you do because God believed that you would do it, but that God believed what he believed because of what you will do. In short, the suggestion is this: your future action causes God's past belief, not the other way around. Now, this is a rather problematic suggestion. Philosophers and scientists usually think causal arrows only run forward. Future events don't cause past events. Causes must precede their effects. But even if we grant the possibility of backwards causation, this reply still falls short. The argument did not suggest that God's foreknowledge is the cause of your action. Again, it admits that you are the cause of your action. You choose the pizza. What the argument points out, however, is that the assumption that God has foreknowledge logically entails, not causes, that you can't choose anything else. Even though you will be the cause of your action, and even if your action will cause God to have the past belief that he did, since God already had the belief, you can't do anything but the very action you must do to cause God to have the belief that he had. This helps us get to the heart of the problem. It might make sense to suggest that our future actions cause God to have the past beliefs that he does about our future actions. We will explore the idea of backwards causation more when we talk about relativity. But even if effects can precede their causes, effects can't exist without their causes. If A causes B, and B is a real existing thing, then A must be a real existing thing. One thing can't cause another unless it actually exists. So if our future actions are what cause God's past beliefs, they must exist in some sense while God is having those past beliefs. If God has beliefs about your actions before they occur, then those actions must exist before they occur. Now, because some philosophers don't like the idea of backwards causation, some philosophers might shy away from saying that your future actions cause God's past belief. Maybe they bring about God's past belief, or God has the past beliefs he does because of your future actions. But it doesn't make a difference. If your future actions are responsible for the content of God's past beliefs in any way, then your future actions must exist in some sense while God is having those beliefs. An event can't be responsible for anything unless it exists. Perhaps the easiest way to think about it is this: God knows what the future holds because he's already seen it. But if he's already seen it, then it must exist. It's impossible to see something, to have knowledge of it, unless it exists. But if the future already exists before it happens or occurs, then how could anything happen besides what the future already contains? Sorry, that was a rhetorical question. Obviously, it couldn't. If our future actions are already written on the timeline, so to speak, then there are no alternate possibilities, and thus we are not free. Think about when you go to the movies. Movies come in big giant fat reels that are put through a projector where every frame of the movie is laid out in sequence. Now, as you are watching the movie, you have no idea how it will end. There seem to be a million possibilities. But that's only because you haven't seen the entire movie yet. In reality, there's only one possibility. The ending of the film is already sitting in the reel. As you watch the movie, you're just moving closer toward it. Nothing else but what is in that reel could occur. Your ignorance about what is in the reel does not mean the movie could end in any other way. The same would be true of an already existing future. It may seem like there are many possibilities, but in actuality, there is only one: the future that already exists. Your ignorance about what the future already holds does not mean that it could hold anything else. So now we realize why exactly divine foreknowledge is incompatible with human free will. It's not because the existence of God's foreknowledge somehow interferes with your ability to choose. No, it's because the assumption that God has foreknowledge entails that the future must exist before it occurs. It must be there for God to know about it. And if the future exists before it occurs, we can't be free. There are no alternate possibilities. In short, we can say that foreknowledge is incompatible with free will because it entails a temporal ontology, a view about which times exist, that is incompatible with free will. Another way philosophers try to avoid the freedom foreknowledge problem is by suggesting that God is timeless, that God exists outside of the entire timeline, past, present, and future, and knows it as a whole. But given our now clear understanding of the problem, we can see why that doesn't resolve the dilemma either. Suggesting that there is a timeline for God to exist outside of reinforces the idea that the entire timeline, including the future, exists, and thus reinforces the temporal ontology that is incompatible with free will. Others might try to avoid the problem by suggesting that the future is changeable. But although this is a popular device in science fiction movies, the notion that the future is changeable is actually logically incoherent. Think about what it implies. It was true that some future event was going to occur, but I did something and now it won't occur. How does that even make sense? To see why it doesn't, let me use an example. It was true that I was going to fail the metaphysics final, but then I studied hard and I passed. Well, if you passed, then it wasn't true that you were going to fail. How can it have been true that some event was going to occur at a particular time if when you arrive at that time, that event doesn't occur? Now, it might be true that if you hadn't studied, then you would have failed. That makes sense. But that's different than saying that it was true that you were going to fail before you studied, but then it became false that you were going to fail after you studied. If you studied, then it was true that you were going to study before you studied, and thus it was true that you were going to pass before you studied. The fact that the future would have been different had you not studied does not entail that the future actually ever was different. So you can't change the past, but you also can't change the future. So, God's foreknowledge would entail a temporal ontology, a view of time that is incompatible with free will. To avoid this consequence, some philosophers, called open theists, have denied that God has foreknowledge. Consequently, they may be able to avoid being committed to this view of time. But, one wonders, what is time really like? What is the correct temporal ontology? Are there other reasons besides God's foreknowledge to think that the future exists before it occurs? If so, denying that God has foreknowledge really won't rescue our free will. In fact, there are other reasons to think that the future exists before it occurs. And understanding why will help us understand the very nature of time and even the nature of truth and what really lies at the root of the freedom foreknowledge problem. Consider an example I often use in class. Take the proposition, the bottle is on the table. There is usually a table in the room I teach in, and usually my bottle of water is sitting on it. What makes that proposition, the bottle is on the table, what makes that proposition true? Its truth can't be without explanation. There is a reason that proposition is true rather than false. So in virtue of what is that proposition true? The obvious answer is this: the bottle being on the table. There is a state of affairs in the world, an actual piece of the world, in which there is a bottle and a table, and the bottle is on that table. What makes the proposition true? In class, I usually point at the bottle on the table and say, that right there, that physical state of affairs in the world, that's what makes it true. Philosophers would call that state of affairs the proposition's truth maker. It's what makes the proposition true. We philosophers usually aren't very clever with our names. But this idea points to the nature of truth and is in line with the most well-accepted theory of truth, the correspondence theory. It states that propositions are true in virtue of their correspondence to the way the world is. Simply put, a proposition is true if it accurately describes the world. Simple enough, and quite intuitive. Sometimes the state of affairs to which a proposition corresponds is quite complex. The truth maker for the proposition Barack Obama is the 44th president of the United States would include facts about how people voted and how people treat our Constitution and how people are willing to submit to the authorities and the will of the majority, but you could find that truth maker in the real world. There actually are other theories of truth, but none are well accepted. Some have suggested that coherence can determine truth. If a set of propositions is coherent, then the propositions in that set are true. But although coherence is required for truth, coherence is not sufficient for truth. After all, The Lord of the Rings is a coherent story, but it's not true. Others have suggested that truth can be found in pragmatism. If something is useful, then it's true. But again, this doesn't seem right. Newton's view of physics was very useful, but it was proven false by Einstein. We'll talk more about that later too. So, according to the correspondence theory of truth, the most popular and intuitive theory of truth, every proposition must have a truth maker. But here's an interesting question. What would be the truth maker for a proposition about the past? For example, it is presently true that dinosaurs once roamed the earth, right? But there are not dinosaurs today, so what makes the proposition dinosaurs once roamed the earth true? You might say that the dinosaur fossils we have found in the ground make it true, but that's how we know that it's true. That's not what makes it true. Even if no dinosaurs ever died in a circumstance in which their bones would be fossilized, and thus we had no fossil record of them, and no idea that they ever existed, it would still be true that dinosaurs once roamed the earth. After all, you can't make it true that an event never occurred by erasing all evidence of it. So again, what is the truth maker for that proposition about the past? The most obvious answer is this. What makes it presently true that dinosaurs once roamed the earth? The past event of dinosaurs roaming the earth. But how can past events determine the truth value of a proposition that is currently true? If the proposition is presently true, wouldn't that event have to presently exist? A truth maker can't make something true unless it exists, right? After all, if I take the bottle off the table, and thus the state of affairs of the bottle being on the table no longer exists, then it is no longer true that the bottle is on the table. So if the past event of dinosaurs roaming the earth is what makes it presently true that dinosaurs once roamed the earth, then the past event of dinosaurs roaming the earth must exist. It's not presently occurring, that's obvious, but the event must in some sense exist. So in general, we need to include past events in our temporal ontology. Otherwise, no proposition about the past has a truth maker. But the exact same thing would follow about propositions regarding the future. Just like propositions about the past, propositions about the future also presently have a truth value. Thus, we need presently existing truth makers for them too. But what else could serve as a truth maker for a proposition about the future, except the future event to which it refers? So we must include the future in our temporal ontology too. If it is true that you will eat pizza for lunch at noon tomorrow, then the event of you eating pizza for lunch at noon tomorrow must already exist. It must already be written on the timeline. It's not occurring, that's correct, but it exists. And since, as we've already discussed, a temporal ontology that includes an already existing future is incompatible with free will, the mere fact that there are true propositions about the future entails that we cannot be free. In fact, since it seems obvious that there are presently true propositions about the entire past and the entire future, even if we don't know which ones are true or false, it seems that we are committed to believing that all moments in time exist. Now, it's probably important to note, for those already familiar with the philosophy of time, that such a temporal ontology is incompatible with free will, regardless of whether you adopt an A theory or a B theory of time. Philosopher John McTaggart coined these terms and used them to describe different ways of conceiving of a temporal ontology in which all moments in time exist. The A series is dynamic. It changes. All moments in time are laid out in order, but in addition to facts about the order of events, there are also facts about which of these events have occurred, which is occurring, and which will occur. In other words, in addition to order, there are facts about what is past, present, and future. Think again of the movie reel. All the frames already exist and are all laid out in order, but only one at a time is having a light shown through it and appears on the screen. The moments in time which have already been displayed are the past. The one that is currently being displayed is the present, and the ones that have yet to be displayed are the future. The B series is static. There is no past, present, or future. All temporal events still exist, and exist in a particular order, but there is no fact of the matter about which ones are past, present, or future. No facts about which ones have occurred, are occurring, or will occur. They're just there, kind of like a movie reel that's not being shown. But in either case, both the A series and the B series are incompatible with free will. In both of them, the events are locked in place. Nothing but what is written on the timeline can occur. And since free will requires alternate possibilities, both theories are incompatible with human free will. So the fact that there are true propositions about the future is enough to threaten free will. And that means it's not merely God's foreknowledge that's incompatible with free will, the mere possibility of God's foreknowledge is incompatible with free will. Even if God doesn't exist, the fact that there are truths about the future entails that it would be possible for God to have foreknowledge if he existed. And it's not possible for God to have foreknowledge unless there are truths about the future for him to know. But of course, as we've seen, if there are true propositions about the future, we cannot be free. So even the atheist can't avoid this problem by saying that God doesn't exist. If you admit that foreknowledge is even possible, it seems you have to admit that we don't have free will. To drive this point home, consider one of my favorite thought experiments, the story of Osmo, which I first came across in Richard Taylor's book, Metaphysics. Osmo was in the library one day and comes across a book entitled The Story of Osmo. Intrigued, he opens it and discovers that the book chronicles the events of his life. He starts at the beginning and reads through to the current day. It is completely accurate. But then he notices two things. One, the book was covered with dust and clearly has been on the shelf for a very long time. In fact, the copyright date is before his birth. In addition, the book is not over. Although he has yet to read them, there are chapters chronicling his future activities. Anxious, he turns to the last page to read the last sentence, which declares that he dies in a fiery plane crash at LAX. He stops and says, "Well, I guess now that I know, I'll never board a flight to LAX." Wondering whether it will get any of its future predictions right, he turns back to the current day's page and reads, "After finding this book, reading to this page, skipping to the end, and then reading this sentence, Osmo realizes that he forgot to pick up his daughter at daycare." "Oh no," Osmo declares, "I forgot to pick up my daughter." When he returns to the library, the book is gone, which is too bad because he never got an opportunity to read the entire last paragraph, which read, "And then, on a flight to San Francisco, Osmo's plane is diverted to LAX. In a mad panic, because he had read the last sentence of this book, he commandeers the cockpit despite not knowing how to fly. He dies in a fiery plane crash at LAX." The existence of this book clearly seems to entail that Osmo is not free. He could not live his life any other way than the way the book described it. But the existence of the book didn't actually make Osmo not free. It lets us realize that he is not free because it lets us realize that his life is already written. It was written before he even existed. And the fact that the propositions in the book are true is enough to entail that his life is already written. But notice that the book need not exist for those propositions to be true. A proposition is true regardless of whether it's ever written down or not. The book is just a collection of those propositions written down, but the propositions are still true even if the book doesn't exist. The mere possibility of such a book about Osmo, that there is a set of true propositions accurately describing Osmo's life, is enough to entail that his future is written and thus that he is not free. But notice that this is true of all of us. There is a set of true propositions that accurately describe your life. They could be collected into chronological order in a book. Set 1 billion monkeys at typewriters for 1 billion years, and one of them would type that book. A book entitled The Story of Insert Your Name Here is possible. But if it's possible, then you're not free. That would entail that your future is already written, and thus that there are no alternate possibilities. It seems to get out of this problem and rescue human free will, we're going to have to deny that there are truths about the future. We'll have to say, it's not true that anything will occur until it occurs. And that would be nice. The problem with this suggestion is that it denies one of the three fundamental axioms of logic, fundamental axioms that underlie every branch of science, mathematics, and philosophy, basically all of human knowledge. And that axiom is that every proposition has a truth value. Every proposition is either true or it's false, in which case its negation is true. If you deny this rule, not only does all of logic and reasoning fall apart, but it has really strange results. It seems obviously true, in fact it must be true, it's a tautology, to say that either you will eat pizza for lunch tomorrow or you won't. This is called a disjunction, an either-or statement. And disjunctions are true only if one of the disjuncts is true. The proposition A or B is true only if either A or B is actually true. If neither is true, then it's not the case that at least one of them is true. But if you say that it's not true that anything will occur until it occurs, then you can't say it's true that you will eat pizza for lunch, but you also can't say it's true that you won't eat pizza for lunch. So it's not true that you either will or will not eat pizza. But that's crazy. Not only is it obviously true that if you do eat pizza tomorrow, it was true today that you would, but it seems undeniably true that either you will or you won't. But the fact that it seems crazy doesn't mean some people haven't tried to deny this fundamental axiom of logic. To do so, you would have to rewrite your entire logical system, rethink the very way that we reason, but this is exactly what some people have done, usually by proposing what is called a multi-valued logical system. Many multi-valued logics have been proposed, but none have been fully developed in a way that avoids troubling objections. In fact, one of the things that these logics have a lot of trouble doing is preserving the truth of statements like either you will or you won't eat pizza for lunch tomorrow. The law that says that all propositions that take the form either A or not A are true is called the law of excluded middle, and that law is difficult to preserve in multi-valued logical systems. But let's say you embrace a multi-valued logic. Or let's say that you're not convinced that the fact that there are truths about the future entails that the future exists. Still, the notion of human free will faces some grandiose threats. First of all, as we shall see later, the fact that there are true propositions about the future is not the only thing that entails a temporal ontology that is incompatible with free will. Einstein's relativity does this as well. But, as we shall see next lecture, a temporal ontology that includes an already existing future is only one of many threats to the idea that humans possess free will.